I'm Jay Bryant. I'm the senior technical writer and really the only technical writer for the Spring project. And so also Josh is one of our folks who works on Spring security and is an absolute genius on security. If Josh says something about security, you can take it to the bank. Very true. On that note, I'm going to turn it over to Josh and let him start the presentation. We're going to take turns, and it's Josh's turn first. So, go ahead, Josh.
All right. Thank you very much, Jay, for those kind words, and I will reciprocate them. Jay has spent his entire life doing technical writing, mentoring others, teaching others about good writing style, and he mentors all of us on the Spring team, helping us write better documentation. And whatever Jay says about writing, you can take that to the bank. Writing, I have a little bit. I have my vocation all day, every day is security. So it's not writing, and what that means is Josh has a lot of passion for good writing. If Jay says to do it, you make sure to do it. If Josh says to do it, just surreptitiously look over at Jay, and if he's smiling and nodding, then you can do what I say too. Before we get that far, though, we do have a legal statement that we want to show, because some of the things that we're going to be showing in reference to some of the Spring documentation is pre-release. For example, some that we'll be showing in the Spring security documentation won't be released until next week. And so because of that, we want folks to be aware of this legal statement, and feel free to peruse it at your leisure. And we'll go ahead and move on from that and get started. I want to share with you, first of all, 3 surefire ideas to make people read your documentation with reckless abandon. The first idea is clickbait. If you clickbait people into reading your documentation, then they will definitely read it and love it. Examples that we have learned from marketers and advertisers everywhere. Black hats were furious when they saw us using this best practice. People will be guaranteed to click on that link and they will read your docs. Or, my CTO doubled my salary after this simple trick saved the company millions. So clickbait is our first idea for you. Our second idea is chastisement, getting mad at your users. Certainly your users and your customers love getting berated by you. And so if you want them to read the manual, then maybe tweet at them and say, hey, you should just read the frickin' manual. And then I'm sure people will read it at that point. Or our best idea is reverse psychology. When they go to your documentation, make sure to claim to them, you're the 1 millionth visitor to our documentation, throw some confetti around and show them some exclusive links that if they click on them, then they get to a certain portion of your documentation that no one else has ever seen. And that will definitely make their day. So if you do those 3 things, then people will read your documentation, and that's it. That's our presentation. I'm kidding. We have 5 real ideas for you. Those 3 don't do them at all. They're not good ideas, but these 5 are good ideas, and they are things that we on the Spring team regularly try to follow in order to make our documentation helpful. And I'm going to list the 5 here, and then, as Jay mentioned, we'll trade back and forth to describe each one of these and specific techniques that you can follow in order to employ them. The first one is to know your audience. It's critical to know who you're talking to. A simple example of this is if I'm speaking English and I'm trying to talk to someone who does not speak English, it doesn't matter how articulate I am with my words. They're not going to get the idea that I want them to have. I have to find some other way to communicate the idea, and knowing what they're capable of from a skill level standpoint or from a linguistic standpoint or whatever may be their background will be helpful to me in communicating ideas. Second, we want to be minimal and direct. These are 2 attributes that are ascribed to Ernest Hemingway that are hallmarks of his writing style, and they're really the inspiration for linking Hemingway to some of the things we ought to be thinking about with reference documentation. Jay will talk to you about that. And then I'll talk to you about making it stick. It's important that our documentation be easy to understand, easy to remember, and thus easy to apply in a real world situation. And I'll mention some different strategies that you can follow in order to achieve that. Then Jay will talk to you about writing for everyone. Certainly, if we have an international audience or multicultural audience, we want to be thinking about those things, sensitive to those things, and doing so will ensure that the vast majority of your audience will understand more quickly and be able to apply the principles better. And then the last thing that we need to do is, we're engineers. We test everything that we produce, and documentation is no different. We test our code ad nauseum. We should be testing our documentation too. And I'll share with you in the end some techniques that you can follow and perform in order to regularly test your documentation to make sure that it's filling the needs that it's intended to. So let's get right into it. First, know your audience. There are a couple of questions that you want to consider when you're thinking about evaluating your audience and making sure that you're addressing them. The first is, how skilled are your users? You actually might answer this question and say, I don't know. I don't know how skilled they are. We haven't done the market research, or we don't really know our audience very well. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. What should we do about that? Well, Alan Cooper has done some research on this. You might recognize him as being the father of Visual Basic. He's also written some books on interaction design. And in those books, he says that learning a skill or activity follows a statistical bell curve. If you map users against their skill levels, then generally speaking, for any skill or activity that you're trying to teach and they're trying to learn, there will be a small number of beginners on the left, a small number of experts on the right, and then that leaves the bulk, the center mass of the bell curve for the intermediates. In fact, Alan Cooper goes on to describe these people as perpetual intermediates, because from the perspective of those trying to teach, it always seems like we have a large set of people who aren't at the absolute beginner end and aren't super duper skilled and are veterans with our software or our product. Alan Cooper goes on to say a little bit more, though. He says that beginners don't stay beginners for very long. Either they migrate into the intermediate bulk after getting familiar with our product or our framework or our library, or if they can't progress into intermediacy, then they just leave and they go find some other product or activity where they can progress into intermediacy. This is absolutely true with Spring Security. We recognize on the Spring Security team that people don't do security all day, every day. And so because of that, we need to help people get from beginner to intermediate as fast as we can. If we don't, then they'll go find some other product, some other framework. They will get their application secure, or they'll try to get it secure because they have deadlines to meet and they need to release their products. That applies to all of us in general. For example, what should you do about this? First, focus on your intermediates. That's the bulk of your reader base most of the time. And there's one other group that I want you to focus on, and that is your beginners who are trying to become intermediates. These two groups, if we can help these two groups, will help the vast majority of people who are reading our documentation. And what does that mean in sort of a more concrete way? We'll get to that in just a minute. I want to ask you one more question, and then we'll get to a concrete example of how to apply this, how to focus on your intermediates and also help out your beginners who are trying to become intermediates. The second question then that I want you to ask yourself, and they really go together, is how do your users learn? And again, you might say, well, I don't know. And for that, we can turn to another fellow named Neil Flemings. And he has done a bunch of research over a number of years to look at the different ways that people learn, and he found that there are 4 different faculties that our brains employ when we're trying to learn something new. And he described them as visual, audio, reading and writing, and kinesthetics. And a number of these are probably familiar to you. You might have said before, I'm a visual learner, or I'm an audio learner. Kinesthetics is when you learn by example or you learn by experimentation. Any of you, when you were a child that took apart a toaster, in order to figure out how it worked, you were using a kinesthetic pattern for learning. And Neil Flemings, in his research, he dices and slices it across age, across education level, career, all kinds of other things. And when he looks at the engineering slice, he sees this kind of behavior where engineers favor kinesthetic learning a lot more than reading and writing. And it's no surprise, any one of us that's a software engineer or is looking at becoming a software engineer, we tend to like to play with things more. We understand it better once we write the code or once we're able to play with someone else's code. And so in thinking about this this should hit home really hard when we're thinking about our documentation, to understand that many engineers learn in a way other than reading. And so unless you're the mythical J. Bryant, who loves reading documentation from front to back just like a novel, if your documentation is just words, then it's not going to address the majority of your audience. We need to think about other kinds of things that we can employ that help our audience understand the ideas that we're trying to transmit. So what's a concrete example? On the left is a bad example, an intentionally bad example. Mario Fusco is a great guy to follow on Twitter. He's really funny, and he's got an example of really bad documentation. You can see that the picture on the left doesn't do anything to help the reader understand how to use this widget. It's comical looking at how bad and unhelpful that documentation is. And of course, the equivalent over in Java is getter and setter documentation. I know that you have never written documentation like this. Only your friends have. But when your friends did this, they wrote the method name, and then the description is exactly the same as the method name, and it doesn't actually help anybody understand it any better. So let's look at some real documentation. This is actually a real method in Spring Security, get entity ID in our SAML support. Here's what the documentation really looks like for that method. You can see that there's quite a bit more information here. Don't worry, you don't have to parse it all. I'm going to just point out 3 things here that this JavaDoc does to try and address the 2 questions that I mentioned earlier. First, skill level. You'll notice here that there are links inside of this documentation. Why are there links? Well, it's because our intermediate users probably already know what an entity ID is. But our beginners don't. They're brand new to this documentation. They're probably brand new to the problem domain. And so we want to give them a link so they can dive deeper and learn what an entity ID is, so they know if they need to even go get one, and once they have it, what they might do with it. There's also more detail for intermediate users. For example, there's a bit more of an advanced feature with this ID, which is that Spring Security supports placeholders inside of this value. So if you use these placeholders inside of the entity ID that you declare, then Spring Security will resolve them at the right time at runtime. That's something that a beginner probably doesn't care about. That's a more complicated feature, but an intermediate user is really happy to know that they can have a more dynamic entity ID by exercising this more detailed feature. You also notice that there are additional links here even still to allow the intermediate user to dive deeper and learn a little bit more about how that's done. And then lastly, you'll notice that there are multiple modes of presentation here. There's markup. There's white space here. The code is demarked as code versus what's just regular English text. And those different things help draw the reader's eye towards what we need them to understand and know, and understand it with clarity. So if we do, so these are some concrete examples. And some brief concrete examples. Jay is going to go over some more detail about how we can employ reading and writing being minimal and direct. But before we get there, I want to show you just 2 more questions that I want you to keep in mind, and then we'll hop over to Jay. The first one is, what was it like when I didn't know this? This is a really hard question to answer when we're writing documentation. The reason that we're writing the documentation is because we know how to do the thing. But there was a time when we didn't know how to do the thing. And guess what? During that process, you forgot the things that you forgot what you had to learn along the way. This is a harder question to answer, but over the next 4 sections, I want you to see if we can learn together about how to get ourselves outside of our head and outside of the things that we're accidentally skipping over, and start noticing those. There are many things that we can do to help out with that. And then the second is, am I writing to be heard or to help? It's really tempting when we're writing documentation to tell everybody the whole harrowing story of how we got here and why we did it this way and so on. We want to connect with people. We're social beings. And there are a lot of reasons that we might want to be heard. But remember, with reference documentation, the reason they're reading it is because they have a problem that they need to solve. And so our goal is to get them there as fast as possible. So in these next few sections, we're going to go ahead and talk about how to be more helpful than be heard, and how to realize the things that you don't know, or the things that you didn't know before you wrote, to make sure to include those things. So now I'll turn it over to Jay for the next section.
Thank you, Josh. Let's see. We're gonna talk first about how to be a minimalist. Hemingway was famous for it, justifiably so. And it really helped his writing style. And one of the things that really matters, I want to back up for a second, focus on that. One thing that matters about a minimalist, nobody's reading the material that we write for fun, with the possible exception of me. I really do sit down and read through API guides to see how they're written. But most people are trying to come in, get an answer to a problem, and get back to work, right? And that's our goal, is to help them return to being productive, right? Okay, so first thing on the list is just don't use any more words than you need to. I've stolen an example from our documentation, and yes, I've already made the commit to fix this. But as you know, the first one is, I'll just read it to you. The fact that Java is used to implement the web service is an implementation detail, an important detail, but a detail nonetheless. Well, this whole business of an important detail, but a detail, we could just leave that out, right? We should never be telling anybody unimportant detail, right? If it's not an important detail, don't put it in the document. If it's an important detail, fine. But we can assume, the reader should be able to assume that everything we put in the document is for some reason important. You need to know that. Right? If that's not the case, we shouldn't put it in, and the reader should be able to rely on that contract. So we rewrite that a little bit to mostly drop out that last phrase and say using Java to implement the web service is an implementation detail. Much shorter, cleaner, really easier to follow. So next one is use the present tense. It's sometimes called the simple present or the indefinite present. I kind of like indefinite because we often say things like, you need to do X, Y, and Z, right? And of course, we mean that, when you get around to it at some point in the future, but we're saying it like it's right now. You need to do X, Y, and Z. And that's actually the right thing to do because we don't know when it's going to happen, even if it's going to happen. They may not do it. So we stick to the indefinite present. And it also then greatly simplifies our writing, right? So here's another example, and again, stolen straight from our documentation. And yes, I've made the commit to fix it. In this tutorial, we will define a web service that is created by a human resources department. Okay. But we can instead just leave out the will, right? And it says basically the same thing. But if we do that throughout the entire guide, it'll just be more consistent, right? So in this tutorial, we define a web service that is created by a human resources department, right? Very little difference in meaning, but it's one word shorter. And if we do it again throughout the entire guide, right, it's consistent across itself, and it's always a little bit shorter. And sometimes, in certain cases, depending on your sentence structure, it can be a lot shorter. So prefer shorter words. This is one of my favorites personally, and I'll put in one of my examples as one of my favorites. You can always replace utilize with use, right? I'm not sure how utilize actually became a word, right? It probably got a back formation from utilization. But really, you can always replace it with use and save yourself 2 syllables and 4 letters, right? The next one is allows you to, right? And you just say lets you. And there's a million of these. You can find lists of them online. But these are 2 of the really common ones. And then I'm just going to leave this thought with one of my favorite quotations from my favorite authors. Is don't use a $5 word and a 50-cent word will do, right? Don't try to demonstrate to the world how smart you are by trotting out all these big words. No, just say it as simply as you can so that the person who's reading the document can pick it up as quickly as possible. And that's all you need to do. Okay. This one's really important, right? Be direct. Okay. How to be direct. First one is talk directly to the audience, right? Use the second person. Don't say we recommend that. Just say you should do, right? For one thing, it's shorter. And for another, it's more engaging. You'll draw the person reading your documentation into the documentation. They'll be more engaged and they'll understand more successfully because they're more engaged. So it's a subtle thing. It's a small technique, really, but it's very subtle and very powerful when you get used to it. The other one, of course, just avoid the passive voice, right? You always want to have an agent for whatever the action is in your sentence. You always want somebody to be doing something instead of somebody just being something, right? And then here's an example again, stolen again from our documentation. Note that in Spring WS, writing the WSDL by hand is not required. Well, for one thing, it's passive, which is a problem. And we're not addressing anybody directly, right? So we can fix that by going to this. Note that in Spring WS, you need not write the WSDL by hand, right? Now we're addressing them directly. And we've dropped the passive, right? And so it's a stronger, better, and shorter sentence. On the whole, it's a good thing. Now I'm going to turn you over to Josh for the next part of this.
Thank you, Jay, once again. Oops, sorry, I forgot to advance my slides. I was so engaged with you, Jay, that I was just listening and forgot to advance. So what I get to talk to you about now are strategies that you can employ to help your documentation be more easily or more quickly understood and more easily remembered. If it can be understood and remembered, then it can be correctly applied by your users and by your customer base. So let's talk about a few strategies. These will hark back to some of the learning modes that we learned about earlier. And I want to talk about a few visual ones and a couple kinesthetic ones. So the first one that you can begin with in your documentation is adding white space. It may seem simple, but white space lets your users breathe. It lets your content breathe too. What I mean by that is that if you've ever tried to read a paragraph that is 10 sentences long or a sentence that is 75 words long, you mentally like stop breathing a bit because you're trying to get the entire idea from the single sentence or from that large paragraph before your mind can take a break and think about other things. In a world of lots of distractions, lots of priorities, it's important that we keep our information bite-sized. And the rule that I follow here is the 23-300 rule. I try to keep my sentences 20 words or below. A 20-word sentence is already a pretty long sentence. I try to keep my paragraphs to 3 sentences long, and I try to keep my sections down to 300 words or less. Each of these gives my readers, your readers, an opportunity to take a mental breath while they are learning the material that you're trying to demonstrate. But it also naturally adds white space into the documentation, which can help it feel a little bit cleaner. This has a number of indirect benefits as well. For example, it is easier from an accessibility standpoint for our readers who need something that is high contrast in presentation. If the screen basically looks thick black because it's all just writing in big paragraphs, that's going to be a little bit harder on the eyes. Having additional white space makes it easier on the eyes to view. Also, you get a benefit with linking, and I'm going to talk in more detail about linking in just a moment, so I won't say much about this. But if you consider that when you add sections into your documentation, tools like AsciiDoc will automatically create anchor links for you. So you get this indirect benefit from adding white space by having links directly to sections in your docs. This is nice when you're trying to tell somebody how to do something, how to use your web app, how to use the mobile app, how to use your API. And you can take them directly to that section. You don't have to give them like vague instructions on how to go to the documentation, then scroll down to this section, look at the table of contents or something. You just take them right there, and that's really quite nice. And there's also an SEO benefit to doing this. Anybody that's done any information extraction before knows that it is easier to extract information from a structured document than an unstructured one. And as you add sections into your documentation, you're adding structure and relevance with additional like H2 and H3 blocks that allow search engines and other things that are trying to analyze your document programmatically to be able to draw important information out of it. Overall, white space makes your documentation more clean. It's easy to walk through a clean room. It's easy to walk through clean documentation. And here's just a quick example of that. This is some recently rewritten documentation from Spring Security. You can see here that the sentences are short, the paragraphs are short, and the sections are short. In fact, there are several sections here, and each one of these has an anchor tag that allows us, when we're on Stack Overflow or something like that, to be able to link somebody directly to the section that will answer their question. You can also see that because of these rules that we're following, that there's a lot more white space in here, and it's a little easier on the eyes. The next thing that you can do visually is linking. Linking helps your users dive deeper. We already saw an example of that earlier in the Getter documentation, where there's a link that allows our beginners who don't really know what an entity ID is yet, click on that and learn more. There are other things that you can get from links too, though. One is evidence. There will be times in your documentation when you need to defend your rationale or explain the authority that you drew it from. For example, one place that Spring Security does this a lot is with RFCs. There are RFCs that have been vetted by the security community, and because of that, they're the ones that Spring Security uses in order to decide how they're going to develop their API, the public API. And so in our documentation, we link to those RFCs so that the reader has a solid idea of our rationale for why we did something the way we did it. We did it because the RFC told us to do it, for example. There's also with links, thinking again about the visual benefit that links give us, it gives a slight subtle emphasis because in most documentation, a link is a different color than the rest of the text. And if your documentation does not have links as a different color, change that, because links are a great way to draw the reader's attention to something that is just a little bit more important than the rest of the sentence and still have it read nicely and naturally. You also get the benefit of, if you have links inside of your documentation, you can link back to other areas in your documentation for to help give background information. This is especially important in a day and age when the way that people arrive at your documentation is through some kind of Google search. They have a problem. The search engine decides that this section of your documentation is the correct place to go, so it takes them straight there. And now they're in the middle of your great forest of documentation. And as they're reading, maybe it references something that was discussed earlier in the documentation. And as we've already said before, Jay is the only individual on the planet that reads documentation from front to back like a novel. So your reader is there right in the middle, and they don't know the thing that you just referred to. So internal linking is really important so that folks can get that background information that they don't have already. Thinking about SEO, we talked about SEO earlier with whitespace. Thinking about SEO once again with linking and how it's beneficial there. When you have a link, the text inside of that link is something that search engines analyze in order to try and decide what your content is all about. So here's a quick don't. I don't have many don'ts here. I have lots of do's. One don't do what I call a here link. Don't link over the word here. It doesn't help search engines and it doesn't help your readers. Your readers now look at the wrong word in the sentence. They're visually, they're drawn to the wrong word, and now they have to backtrack to figure out what you're linking to read the rest of the sentence first, and search engines can't draw any information from the word here. It's not relevant enough. So better just delete that sentence and go link to something earlier in the paragraph that is more conversationally relevant to what you're trying to link to. In the end, links make your documentation more credible. And I want to show you a quick example of that. Here, oh, wait, sorry, I have a public service announcement too that I almost forgot. And that's why I have an extra thing here to remind me. Also, your links, please, they should all be HTTPS. Don't use HTTP anymore. There are enough HTTPS links out there. Penetration has gone far enough over the last few years. We've done a lot of work in the security community to encourage and make it easy for everybody to upgrade. So these days, if it's an HTTP link, then I don't include it in my documentation. It's not important enough for me to put there. So keep that in mind as you're writing your own documentation. Great, so here's an example. We've got 3 different links that I want to point out here in the Spring Security documentation. One is here. You can see that if someone gets dropped in the middle of our documentation to learn more about resource servers, they probably don't know what a security filter chain is. It would be super bummer if we just started talking about, well, just use this in the security filter chain, and somebody's like, I have no idea what that is. And it's very reasonable for them to not know, because this is their first exposure to our documentation at all, say. So the security filter chain, you'll see that it's highlighted for code and that it's a link that will take them back to explaining what the security filter chain is. And then they can easily come back to this documentation once they have the background that they need. Another example is the www authenticate header. It's probably the case that some readers don't know what this header is. And so there's a link to an authoritative source that can tell them that. And then here at the top, we have a link to JOTs. We have a link to the RFC for JOT, so that folks understand what they can expect in the Spring Security API. When we say JOT, we mean this thing that was defined in this RFC over here, and it describes how folks that support JOT should write their code. So these links help to make our documentation more credible and make it easier to understand why it is certain things are the way that they are. Next visual thing that we can do is think about formatting. This one seems almost obvious, like maybe it should have been the first thing that we talked about, but I want to talk about something specific with it. With formatting, I mean things like bolding, italics, underlining, stuff like that. But specifically when it comes to technical documentation, we often want to think about highlighting for code, because it can really reduce the cognitive load when we read. You and I are in our IDEs all day long. We live there. We look at the monospace font. We are used to code highlighting, and that becomes something that we're very used to reading, and maybe we can even read that faster than we can read English or text, regular text. So we want to make sure to format our code. Some of the things that that achieves for us is it reduces ambiguity. For example, let's say that we're talking about URLs in our documentation. Well, there happens to be a Java class also called URL. So we can clarify to the reader whether we're talking about just URLs as a concept, or if we're talking about the class URL by marking it as code. If we use backticks or whatever might be our underlying markdown that we're using, we mark it as inline code so that it's formatted differently so that folks know where they're talking about the Java class URL instead of just URLs as a concept. Also keep in mind color coding. If you are going to use color coding, anybody that's used an IDE in the past 15 years has enjoyed the wonderful blessing that is code highlighting. It helps us know what's a keyword, what's a static method, what's an instance method, and all manner of other types of nuances in our code are readily understood by virtue of formatting and by virtue of color coding. Consider when you're doing your color coding that if you want to use 3 or 4 colors, what have you, inside your syntax highlighting in your documentation, it should remain the same number of colors regardless of the reader's visual condition. There are color palettes that you can use for your code highlighting that are compatible with varying degrees of color blindness. So take that into consideration as you are alluding just a little bit to what Jay's going to talk about writing for everybody. As you're thinking about, we want to make sure that our documentation is understandable for everyone. Formatting, like I said, clarifies ambiguities. It makes your documentation clear, especially because that's where we are all day long is in the code. Here's a couple of quick examples. Notice here in the header, I've demarked this as code because I'm not talking about, say, the concept of juke set URIs, which is a concept that's important for resource servers. I'm talking about the specific Spring Security method that is called juke set URI, and the demarcation reduces that ambiguity. Also, you see that we're highlighting code here. With the code coloring here, it's easy to see what's an attribute value, what's an element, and so on inside of the documentation. The last visual one that I want to show you is about diagrams. This is probably the thing that maybe comes to mind first when we think about communicating visually as we communicate with pictures. Diagrams are there to clarify relationships. UML diagrams help us understand class hierarchical decisions. We can look at table relationships, or we can look at railroad diagrams for seeing how an HTTP request flows through like a complicated authentication flow. Whatever it might be, a diagram can help us to form the right analogy in our brain to see how things play together. Diagrams, I want you to think about accessibility here as well. Once again, think about your coloring. If you're going to use 4 colors in your diagram, make sure it's 4 colors for everybody. Or if you don't have the capacity to do that, then you can create different shapes and make sure that the shape of this widget in your diagram is consistent and is meaningful across all of your diagrams, so that all readers can understand the nuances that you're trying to describe. Image links, this is kind of a next level, kind of a difficult thing to do, but if you can achieve it, it's also nice for your images to, when you click on them, certain sections of your image, it takes you to the appropriate place in the documentation to describe it better. Finally, there's actually an unexpected benefit to SEO when it comes to diagrams. And it's not precisely that search engines are, maybe they do, maybe they don't, but are giving a higher score to those who have images. It's more a use case. If you, say, have a technical question that you know is going to be better answered by a diagram, and you search for it, let's say you're using like DuckDuckGo or something like that, and you go search for it, and you know you're looking for a diagram, what are you going to do? Well, if you're like me, you're going to click on the Images tab, and then you're going to look for the diagram that best fits, that looks like it's going to describe for you and answer your question. Well, if your documentation doesn't have a diagram, then it won't show up in those image results. And so think about whether a diagram is the appropriate way to describe this problem, so that you can direct your readers accordingly. Diagrams are the things that really make our documentation become, it moves it from being something abstract that we're talking about to something really concrete that people can start seeing some concrete relevance. Here's a quick example from Spring Security. You can see that in 5.4 we added a bunch of diagrams to help folks understand how the HTTP requests interact with the Spring Security filter chain. You can see the different colors, and you can visually understand that this in addition to just breaking up the documentation a little bit, gives us a picture to back up what we're talking about in words to help form the appropriate relationships. And now I want to mention just 2 kinesthetic things that you can do, kinesthetic strategies that you can use to make your documentation more memorable, more understandable, and then thus easier to apply. The first one is use cases. Use cases are, when should I use this? If you look at some old school API documentation, you'll find that there is the name of the class and then a bunch of methods and a description of how each one of those methods work. Well, that's great, except I still don't understand when I would use your class or your methods. What we really want to do is we want to be helping our users see under what circumstances they should be using something like this. A great example in Spring Security is the CSRF documentation. CSRF or CSRF is a vulnerability that folks need to consider when they're developing web applications. However, there are varying degrees of how to address this problem, varying degrees of difficulty, depending on how important it is for you to defend against this particular vulnerability. So because of that, Spring Security has a couple of different ways that you can address it. And in that section of the documentation, there's a long use case discussion to help the reader understand which parts of the API to use correctly. Talking about, in that case, security trade-offs, but trade-offs in general are a place where when you talk about use cases is a place where you can begin talking about trade-offs, helping your readers and educating your readers on the things they should be considering when they're using your product. Case studies are also awesome. If you have room to link to case studies or reference them, the kinesthetic part of us really wants to see what's happening in the real world. Is this solving real problems for real people, and what was the outcome when they did the thing that you said that I should do? And in that vein, if you don't have case studies, at least have real examples. Your examples should be as close to reality, as far away from contrived as possible. Don't ever, another small don't ever use foo, like ever again, because really your reader doesn't know what you know. And so make sure the variable name, make sure the method name, make sure the suggestion is something that you would really genuinely suggest that people actually do, something that's genuinely copy pastable into their IDE, that's something reasonable for them to do. And use cases are what help our documentation be consistent. It ties what might be slightly more theoretical discussion inside of our writing to real live things that people can touch and feel and experience in real life. Very quick example of that is in the Spring Security documentation. You can see one of the first sentences in the resource server docs is, this is handy, this resource servers are handy in circumstances where an application has delegated its authority management to an authorization server, for example, Okta or Ping Identity. So there's a concrete recommendation. You want to use a resource server if you're using an authorization server. And if you're not sure what an authorization server is, you can click there to learn more. Or maybe these couple of examples will help jog your memory. So you're like, oh yeah, we use Ping or we use Okta, or we or click on the authorization server link, and you have a deeper understanding of, now I understand when I would use a resource server. Closely linked to use cases are usage, whether it's screenshots of your app or code snippets. We want to make sure that people see how to really use it, and they can follow our steps, copy the things into their IDE, see them happen, see them work. I tell people that code is worth 1,000 words. And it's really true. You've had an experience before where you've read pages of documentation, but the example gave you an answer so much faster. When you're giving examples, remember pseudocode or polyglot. If you support multiple languages, you should give the examples in all of those languages. And if you can't, that's okay. Pseudocode is fine. It gets the reader further, most likely further than just reading your paragraphs of explanation. Also, if you can make your snippets executable, that's awesome. That's next level. If you can link to samples that allow them to see everything all working together, then incredibly helpful for your readers. Sometimes things are complicated enough where it requires steps. If you write steps, remember that your readers will follow them. Sometimes we forget that, but make sure that you go through the steps just like you explained to make sure that there's no step that was skipped. And that can be really helpful. It's a nice alternative to, say, having a snippet that's like 100 lines long, or some long explanation where they have to infer a bunch of information. If you can stepwise it, then do so. And just remember that folks will follow your steps step by step as you described. Usage documentation is what makes things complete. If you are missing concrete usage documentation, then in my opinion, your documentation isn't finished yet. So make sure to add that before you're all done. So here's a here's a simple example from the Spring Security documentation. You can see here that this is how you would specify an authorization server using Spring Security's resource server, or for Spring Security resource server. This is well formatted. You could copy and paste it right into the code, and it would compile just fine. We can't get to a fully concrete example because we don't have a deployed authorization server that we want people to authorize against. They probably have their own authorization server that's connected to their own users, just like their own database or something like that. But what we do make sure to do is that the URL is a real formatted URL. It uses HTTPS. It indicates that it should be an IDP, and those kinds of things are better than just saying foo URI and assuming that they're going to be able to figure out what we mean by just put any URI here and it'll be fine. You know best. We don't assume that. We let them see the kind of URI that they should be looking for in their authorization service documentation or different things like that. All right, so lots of C's to remember. There's one more C I want you to remember, and that is correct. Your documentation should be correct. This seems painfully obvious, but we forget it so often. How many times have you read documentation where you try to copy the snippet into your IDE and it doesn't compile? Or you have tried to follow the screenshots for a mobile application that you've just like downloaded or whatever, and you try to do the thing, and when you go to the second step, like that button doesn't exist anymore because the images are out of date. Keep that in mind as you're doing these extra things to help out your readers, that they need to stay up to date. They need to be correct. Otherwise your readers will go somewhere else to find something more that's more reliable, that will answer their questions faster, instead of requiring them to go through these ambiguities and try to figure out what you meant when you said something that was really out of date or just incorrect. So now what I'd like to do is turn it back over to Jay. He's going to talk about how we can write for everybody, and specifically an international and a multicultural audience. So Jay, take it away.
Thank you, Josh. So how to write for everyone, right? I'm specifically going to address how to write for an international audience, an audience whose first language is not English, because all the Spring documentation is in English. We think about that a lot. But it turns out that a lot of those techniques that work really well for people whose first language is not English also make it easier to read for the folks whose first language is English. In other words, they're universal techniques that we can use. So without further ado, let's start poking into them. It says one up there because I've got four. I didn't want to fill the whole page with a bunch of stuff. One of the first ones and one of the biggest ones is avoid cultural references, right? These are the things that just don't travel across cultural boundaries. There's a bunch of them. You may think that some movie, for example, is everybody's seen it. No, even within the same culture, there's probably plenty of people that haven't. And especially as you go across cultural boundaries to different nations and different ethnicities and so on, that really becomes true. They have a different background, a different set of cultural artifacts in their lives, and these things just don't travel well. So if you can, avoid them. If you find yourself using them, let's try to think of a different way to say things. If you must use them, there are a few cultural references that tend to be very, very wide-reaching. One of those is sports. One of the examples we use in one of our guides, for example, is football. And so football means something very specific to Americans like me. But around the world, right, it refers to what Americans call soccer, right? So the World Cup is a very popular thing. And as a consequence of the popularity of the World Cup, we can talk about football and it works, right? Everybody understands what that means. We may all mean something a little different because of it. Australian football, American football, British football, soccer, and so on. But we all get the idea there's something called football. We can talk about that. So that works. Swimming is another possibility. So watch out for offensive references. There's one that I keep in mind in particular these days, but there's a bunch of them. One of them, for example, is we think about, maybe we'll use making wine as a example. We've got this application that tracks wine bottles, right? Well, trouble with that is 24% of the world's population belongs to a religion that doesn't drink alcohol. And it's not just one of them. There are a number of religions that choose not to do that. Well, for those people, you've either just left them in the dark, or you may have actually offended them. Don't do that. Right? Reach for references that are very neutral, that have no way to offend anybody, and it can be really hard to find those, but go for it. One of the possible food choices, if you're going to use food, is maybe bread. I mean, every culture has some variety of bread, right? I think they all do. I can't think of any exceptions. Anyway, so let's move on. Page 2, watch out for Latin, right? You're asking people to now understand a third language in the middle of trying to get along with English, right? So some poor guy speaks, for example, say Hindi as his first language, he's dealing with English as well because he learned it at school and he uses it day in and day out for all this technical stuff. And then you're adding Latin to it. It's like, you're not helping, right? So there's a couple of specific ones you really want to avoid. E.g. and I.e., right? E.g., and my other language, by the way, is Latin. That's what I studied in college. Exempli gratia, right? It means for example in Latin. It literally translates to example, please, but it works out. And id est, which literally translates to that is, right? There was a survey done in the 90s, early 90s. I used to subscribe to a journal that published it. More than half the population got these wrong. Either got them backwards, which is most common, or in some cases, just didn't know what they meant at all. So they're not reliable. It's not a reliable way to communicate, right? So take the time to write out, for example, and that is. Use the present tense. Remember, we talked about present tense before, right? For somebody who's English, for who English is not the first language, right? Keeping it all in the same tense, and present tense is the easy one to do, makes it consistent throughout for them, and lets them not think about, is that past tense, is that future tense? How do I parse this, right? No, it's always present tense, right? So they don't have to worry about that. It removes one variable from their complexity when they're reading, and that's a huge help. Also, it generally makes the content shorter. And once you get used to it, once you get into the mode of doing it, like I am all the time, it's actually easier to write. Number 3, don't use contractions. Eh? And speaking of ambiguity, Josh's word that he was using a little bit ago, this is a source of ambiguity oftentimes. And especially for folks whose English is not, for whom English is not the first language. I don't know if you were paying attention in the at the bottom of the screen where it was translating our words into text. But at one point, it translated one of Josh's don'ts into donut, right? That's a great case in point. That's a machine case of it, but the human mind sometimes does exactly the same thing. And what happens when that particular problem arises is the person reading is like, what? And they have to run back and read the whole sentence all over again, right? So for the sake of leaving out one letter, you just wasted their time. Don't do that. Also, all technical writing is a variety of formal writing, like academic writing. And we don't want to break that standard, right? So that's the minor point. The real problem is the ambiguity of it. Avoid humor. Humor does not travel across cultural boundaries at all, right? Very rare that a joke in English works in German, or vice versa. More vice versa. I have a friend in Germany who sends me jokes every once in a while. About one time in 3, I have to ask him, like, huh? He says, because I just have to ask him, explain it to me. Right? And then he ends up with this whole cultural explanation of why that's funny in German, right? And it is funny if you're German, but it's not funny to me, right? So watch out for humor. It's one of the worst things you can try to reach for. And this takes us to another point. Be careful with your terminology, right? Don't try to use 2 words for the same idea. Stick to a single word for a single concept throughout. The reason for that is, A, it's just consistent, which makes it easier for you when you're writing. But it's also much, much easier to understand, because if you're suddenly using 2 words for the same thing, the reader has to ask themselves, does he really mean something a little bit different by that? Or is that really just this thing over here and he's using a different word for it, right? And I'm sorry about my cat walking across the keyboard. Oscar likes to get involved. So anyway, but the point is, stick to the same wording throughout. Now, bear in mind, as Josh mentioned, people are going to jump into your document in the middle, right? They need to see that term, whatever it may be. So, for example, Josh says URL, though I can't think of anything different for URL, but they may see that term, and they need to realize that that's the same term we used in some other part of the documentation. We mean exactly the same thing by that word as we did over there, right? So don't mix up your terms. Don't try to reach for 2 synonyms of the same thing. Now, slide 4. That connects us to the idea of don't try to write literature, right? Technical documentation is not literature. Yes, I read it for fun, but I'm a weirdo. But when you were in school, your teachers may very well told you, well, try to mix up your terminology, right? Try to reach for, vary your sentence length, vary your paragraph length, use synonyms, all those good things. Well, that may be fine, for fiction especially, and for academic writing a little less so. But for technical writing, those things are a problem, right? Because what we're trying to do, and this takes us back to our main goal is to help people. We're trying to get people to the right place in the documentation, get them the answer to their question, and get them back to coding, right? So that they can be productive in their job. So don't try to be fancy, right? Don't try to write literature. Write good explanations. That's what we really need. And that takes us back to our central point in this whole thing. Write to help people, right? Write to answer their questions. Think about the person who's gotten to you by Google. They found some section in your documentation. They need to learn how things work. You may need to link them back to, as Josh pointed out, other sections of the documentation so they can pick up, I got to tell you this story, but if I can tell you that story, right? Make all those kind of things work, but think in terms of getting that person the answer they need and getting them back to their job, which is coding, right? Okay. And that is all I have for the moment. I'll turn you back over to Josh to talk about how to test a document.
Great. Thank you so much, Jay, for all of that great advice. Last point that we want to make today as we talk about documentation is testing. Every good engineer tests their code, and they should test their documentation too. There are tools to help you out. Just like your IDE has a bunch of tools to help you with coding, there are tools to help you write good documentation. IntelliJ ships with plugins, or there are plugins available for IntelliJ that will check your grammar, and then will check your passive voice and things like that. There are SEO plugins, I don't think for IntelliJ specifically, but in other tools that will check your sentence length, check your paragraph length, check your section length. Yoast is an example of that. There are other online tools like Grammarly that can help you choose better words or more common words that are trying to say the same kind of thing. Seek out and use tools to help you become a better writer, and it will help you be faster. Just like when IntelliJ tells you to use like collections.singleton list instead of array.as list to improve your coding, you can do the same thing to improve your docs. Also, read it out loud. I cannot emphasize this point enough. Rereading your documentation out loud uses an additional one of your 5 senses that allows you to be able to see that it doesn't sound as good as you thought it did when you wrote it down. What was in your head that got translated into your fingers, it made sense at that time. But now that I read it with the paragraph in front of it or next to that image that I just added, it doesn't make sense anymore. Or even simple things like, oh, I have 2 thes. And so you have to remove that. Or there's a snippet that you had there originally that doesn't make sense anymore now that you've rewritten things. Reading it out loud is a huge help when it comes to writing documentation. And then finally, peer review. You will always review your code with somebody else. It helps you to write better. It makes you want to double check things because you want the respect of your peer. And you also want it to be understandable for them. Anytime you take a person in your car, you suddenly clean out your car to make sure that it doesn't look messy when you're taking a passenger with them. And the same thing is true with your documentation. Share it with a friend, share it with a coworker or a peer, and it will force you to write it a little bit better. But it also gives us something else. It gives us somebody who wasn't the person that knows, to be able to read it and say, it looks like you skipped a step here because I have no idea how you got from A to B, or maybe A to B just need to be rewritten or something like that. Having someone else read it is absolute gold. And all 3 of these we continue to do over and over as we embrace the idea of rewriting. The first time you write your documentation is definitely not the last, just like the first time you write code is definitely not the last. And the second time you rewrite that method, it's a little bit more efficient, it's a little bit more performant, it's a little bit cleaner. Same thing with your documentation. Embrace the idea of rewriting. In fact, closing quote, the only kind of writing is rewriting. Prepare for this and keep it in mind that when you write your documentation, whether it's JavaDocs or reference docs or whatever it may be, you're going to be writing it and rewriting it to polish it better, just like you would with your code. And that's said by nobody other than Ernest Hemingway, our favorite author for today. So those are the 5 points we wanted to make. I would like to turn it back over to Jay just for a minute to give any closing remarks of wisdom. And then thank you very much for listening. We will see you in the Slack channel, and thank you very much.